Tricksters in Los Angeles. So, as you know, we get our titles from these wonderful quotations about Los Angeles. And this one is from Carrie McWilliams, Southern California, an island upon the land. But does anybody know where a ringside seat at the circus actually exists? The quotation actually exists? Yeah? So, if you go to Pershing Square, and I know no one goes to Pershing Square, but Pershing Square is pretty cool. If you go to the south end of Pershing Square, there's a low kind of curving wall. And this quotation is engraved into that wall. Quote, "My feeling about this weirdly inflated village in which I had come to make my home, haunted by memories of a boyhood spent in the beautiful mountain parks, the timberline country of northwestern Colorado, suddenly changed after I had lived in Los Angeles for 7 long years of exile. I've never been able to discover any apparent reason for this swift and startling conversion, but I do associate it with one particular occasion. I had spent an extremely active evening in Hollywood. That's how they talked in 1946. And had been deposited toward morning by some kind soul in a room at the Biltmore Hotel, which is right, it's adjacent to Pershing Square. Emerging the next day from the hotel into the painfully bright sunlight, I started the rocky pilgrimage through Pershing Square to my office at the LA Times in a state of miserable decrepitude. You ever visited that state, Amanda? The state of miserable decrepitude. In front of the hotel, newsboys were shouting the headlines of the hour. Again, this is 1946 or so. An awful trunk murder had just been committed. Amy Semple McPherson had once again stood the town on its ear by some spectacular caper. A University of Southern California football star had been caught robbing a bank. A love mart had been discovered in the Los Feliz Hills. A love mart. Yes, right around here. A motion picture producer had just wired the Egyptian government a fancy offer for permission to illuminate the pyramids to advertise a forthcoming production. And in the intervals between these revelations, there was news about another prophet, fresh from the desert, who had predicted the doom of the city, a prediction for which I was morbidly grateful. In the center of the park, a little self-conscious of my evening clothes, I stopped to watch a typical Pershing Square advertisement. An aged and frowsy blonde, skirts held high above her knees, cheered by a crowd of grimacing and leering old goats, was singing a gospel hymn as she danced gaily around the fountain. Then it suddenly occurred to me that in all the world there was, nor would there ever be, a place like this city of the angels. Here the American people were erupting like lava from a volcano. Here indeed was the place for me, a ringside seat at the circus. Carrie McWilliams, engraved in Pershing Square. I love that quotation. And I love this series. Thank you for coming out and letting me make shit up and listening to it. So here's what we're doing. I'm only making up some stuff, I guess. What we're trying to do is put on the lenses of mythology and look at our city. Put simply, what does our city look like using the lenses of mythology? What are these lenses? Well, they're creation myths, place myths, hero myths, trickster myths, etc. And I don't know about you, but I'm learning a lot because I really am kind of making this up. I know what myth is and I know what Los Angeles is, and I just put them together when we're together. So this has been a wonderful discovery for me. Thank you for joining me in it. And what have we seen? Well, we looked at creation myths, the town of the Queen of the Angels, and we talked about how Los Angeles was born in the imaginary. It began as a place in a 16th century novel. And when the Spanish actually came here, they thought it was the place because they didn't have that distinction, that rigid distinction between the imaginary and the real. And that's a pretty foundational story for Los Angeles. Los Angeles in the liminal, we talked about. The city of angels. The city on the edge of the sacred, the city that plays with those edges. And maybe the messages come one way and then they go back the other way. Maybe we're sending messages to the sacred. Who knows? We talked about place myths. And continuing, Los Angeles as an unreal city, as a hyper-real city, in fact. A city that existed not only in the novel, but existed in another novel called Ramona, which drove people here. And then the boosters of Los Angeles saw that, capitalized on it, along with the tourists who came and spoke about the region, and suddenly you have a boom. And add to that the railroad coming here, and the population increases dramatically. But the place that it becomes is not a Western city, but as we said, as Teddy Roosevelt said, and we've kind of latched onto, it's a city that's west of the West. Mario and I and Brahmavid were talking about this earlier, how that really rings true for us. We're in the West, but we're not of the West, we're west of the West. And then, of course, we talked about hero myths last time, including the Big Lebowski, Biddy Mason, and Charlie Chaplin, in fact. And we talked about, again, west of the West, the opening scene of the Big Lebowski, how the tumbleweed comes through the city and goes right into the ocean, right, west of the West, and how heroes navigate difference, and that's another element of the stories we've been talking about and telling, is this embedded difference in Los Angeles, unlike other cities. For example, Boston, which has a pretty defined history and not much embedded difference. But it's there at the beginning, even in the indigenous peoples in Los Angeles. And the key to being a hero in Los Angeles is to abide. But that's just like your opinion, man. Tricksters. Preparing this, I realized we need to do more on tricksters. Tricksters are too important. And we're just going to scratch the surface tonight. First of all, let's get some things out about the tricksters. They are figures who are wise and foolish. They trick people and are tricked in turn. They are almost always male. There are a few among the indigenous stories that are female, but almost always male. They are promiscuous and amoral, very much into excessive sexuality and subverting the conventions of morality. They're outrageous. More than that, they're outrageous. They're corporophilic. They love shit, is what that means. They're very much interested in bodily functions of all kinds and bodily fluids of all kinds. I remember teaching my first Native American cultures course at Boston University, and I told a trickster story, and it upset people, and I'm like, right, it's supposed to. And students complained, and they complained to my dean, and I'm like, uh-oh. So he calls me in, and he says, "You've been telling trickster stories?" And I'm like, "Yep." He said, "You pissed some people off?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Good." He knew what a trickster story is. They're often a helper. Well, we'll talk about that. Jung said they were an early rudimentary stage of consciousness, and he has an archetype for them. There are there's one seminal text, wink, wink, on the Trickster by Paul Radine called The Trickster, where he analyzes 49 Winnebago Trickster tales. And they're rated not R, but X. That's one of the ones I told, by the way, about how Coyote casts his penis across the lake to find some young girls. But he says this: the overwhelming majority of all the so-called trickster myths in North America give an account of the creation of the earth, or at least transforming of the world, and have a hero who is always wandering, always hungry, who is not guided by normal conceptions of good or evil, and who is either playing tricks on people or having them played on him, and who is highly sexed. Highly. Almost everywhere he has some divine traits. See, already you're like, wait, what? These vary from tribe to tribe. In some instances, he's regarded as an actual deity. In others, he's as intimately connected with the deities. And still others, he's a generalized animal. Think raven or coyote or rabbit sometimes, or a human being. And this is David Adams Leeming from his great book, The World of Myth. I don't know if you know, but it's a great anthology of world mythology with some very nice introductions. And here's his own point of view on the trickster. Whether it be Hermes in Greece, Krishna in India, Loki in Northern Europe, Coyote or Raven among the Native Americans, or related popular figures such as Aesop's and La Fontaine's fable animals, Davy Crockett on the American frontier, Briar Rabbit in the American South, Inspector Clouseau in the film The Pink Panther, or any number of animated cartoon characters, the trickster is at once wise and foolish, the perpetrator of tricks and the butt of his own jokes. Almost always male, he is promiscuous and amoral, etc. The trickster then speaks to our animal nature, our physical as opposed to our spiritual side, and reflects what Jung called an earlier stage, rudimentary stage of consciousness. He has the charming, if sometimes dangerous, appetites of a child, as yet untamed by the larger social conscience. And of course, he is almost always funny. Now, Lauren showed me that there is it's a class,
it's a
seminar on the trickster at the C.G. Jung Study Institute in Culver City. And who's the focus? Mr. Trump. So let's just get that out of the way. We can talk about it if you want later. Now, those are kind of the features of the character, the trickster. Here's what trickery is. It's about the subversion of mundane, everyday, ordinary meaning. And that's what scares people. That's what makes the trickster dangerous. Because we live by ordinary, everyday meaning. The problem is we live by it. That becomes our life. Instead of just something to get by, our sacred gets locked into the mundane. And the trickster is going to come along and not let you do that. It's also, the trickster figure is an aesthetic and narrative tool for telling stories. The best stories are the trickster stories. They're just the best. They're the most interesting because it's like Aristotle in his Poetics said that drama works because it's a catharsis of pity and fear. That applies to the trickster. You go, oh, look at stupid trickster. Look what happened to him. And it's not always bad. So there's a trickster story where Coyote steals the stars from Badger, I think, and the stars aren't up in the sky, they're down here, and he's not supposed to have them, and sure enough, he's a trickster, so he trips, and the stars all fly up into the sky, and that's where they are now. So there's a creative aspect to it too, but also theft, almost always some kind of theft that comes before the creation. And we're going to talk about this at the end. Paradigm shifts, shifts of the models. Now, every time I see the word paradigm, I think myth. That's just me. It's a model by which we live. For me, that's a story. And my guess is that any paradigm you can describe is probably going to have a story behind it, no matter. So there's Paul Rodin's Trickster, The Trickster. There's a fantastic book that came out about 10 years ago by Lewis Hyde called Trickster Makes the World. Mischief, Myth, and Art. Really good book, and I'm going to come back to it at the end. And then tonight we're going to rely somewhat upon The Mirage Factory by Gary Christ, Illusion, Imagination, and the Invention of Los Angeles. Brand new book, really good. I read it in about 2 days. It was so good. And so I'm going to take Christ's figures that he uses here and talk about them as tricksters. Speaking of which, William Mulholland. Born in Belfast, Ireland, 1855. Ends up in New York City in the 1870s, makes his way to San Francisco, and I'm not telling a good story right now because of time, but he and his brother stow away, and his father's not real kind to them, and he's just trying to make his way. He's trying to get out of Dublin, and he ends up in New York City and works in some lumber camps. Works in a dry goods store in Pittsburgh. I think it was his uncle who was there. Finally makes his way west to San Francisco. Is a miner in Arizona for a little while, fights the Apache for a little while, and then moves to Los Angeles in 1877. And he said this, and this is from Christ, when he was in Pittsburgh. One subject that piqued his Mulholland's interest was California. While in Pittsburgh, he read a book by Charles Nordhoff called California for Health, Pleasure, and Residence. Now, if you've been here, you know what that book's about. I bet. You don't even have to read it. Because we talked about these stories of Los Angeles as a place of healing, about what happens when you move to Los Angeles, that all the Midwestern tourists wrote about when they got here. Remember, if you wanted to pick a melon, you had to get on horseback, and whole lists of things that you're cured of once you arrive in Los Angeles. Which is going to come back, by the way. That story is going to come back into another story. He was intrigued, Mulholland was, by its depiction of an unspoiled place of healthy sunshine, open spaces, and unlimited opportunity. Mulholland said, Los Angeles was a place after my own heart. It was the most attractive town I'd ever seen in 1877. Wasn't much of a town. 1878, he begins work as a ditch digger. So the water in Los Angeles in the late 19th century was just ditches that came from the LA River or wherever. And they had to be, you can imagine, they had to be cleaned out all the time. I think the Spanish word is zanja, is that right? They were constantly being blocked up, and they were your water source. By the way, that's how Bunker Hill develops, is another Canadian, by the way, a man named Prudent Beaudry comes in and buys Bunker Hill, which no one wanted to live on in the late 19th century, because why would you want to live on the hill in the late 19th century when there's no cars and you can't get water and there's no electricity? It was a desolate place, Bunker Hill. So Beaudry, he would later become mayor, comes in and builds his own water pump. The city wouldn't do it, so he built his own. And he ran electricity up there, and suddenly Bunker Hill became the place to be, and was for decades. And then that story goes on, which we can come back to sometime if you want. Then, of course, there was the boom. The great migration of people coming to Los Angeles for all kinds of reasons. for their health, for their business, for all kinds of things, to be near the Ramona sites. So there was a man named, they're watching this, Mulholland and his friend Fred Eaton, E-A-T-O-N, who was a former mayor. They're looking at this and they see the railroad come, and they're watching the Los Angeles population skyrocket. And they're like, you know what? This place is going to need water. You know this story, I think. So they began, in fact, Christ's book opens with Mulholland and Eaton on a wagon heading up into the Owens Valley with just some whiskey and bacon and baked beans. Should have been a great time. They head up into the Owens Valley and they see all this, and eventually there's in fact a water reclamation project underway by the federal government in the Owens River Valley for irrigation of the Owens River Valley, not for Los Angeles, right? So there's lots of money in there, and Eaton hires this guy. He hires the agent, the federal agent, who's working for the federal government and for the people of the Owens River Valley. Supposedly, he hires him, pays him a ton of money, and says, look, when you're out there wandering around, I want you to scope this out for us, because we're going to need this water. Over 200 miles away. And, you know, these are farmers in the Central Valley, basically. They need the water for their crops and to live themselves. So they're very excited about this federal irrigation project that's going to help their farms. Little do they know that the agent supposedly helping them is under hire by Eaton and Mulholland, and who is scoping out the takeover of the valley for its water. Right. Sorry. By the end of 1905, through a combination of normal land purchases, so the agent would find sources of water in the Owens River Valley, which is up near Mammoth and Bishop, up in there. He would find sources of water, and he would come back. He would report back to Mulholland and Eaton and say, "Hey, here's a nice parcel of land. Why don't you buy it?" And they would. And the Owens River Valley people would say, "Okay." You know, they were just grazing there or doing nothing. And if people were resistant, they would simply bribe them and say, "Okay, well, here's more money. We want your land." And they lied. They said it was for grazing and other things. They gave them no sense at all that this water was not going to be theirs. So Mulholland basically and Eaton buy up the rights to the land, therefore the water, and pretty soon the Owens River Valley people see what's happening and begin to resist. Yes. Sorry. Right. So they overcome this resistance, and it increases gradually. The Owens River Valley people really didn't understand the scope of what had been done to them, so it was a gradual dawning of what happened to them. So the resistance grows as they learn more about what's happening. But by 1913, Mulholland has finished the aqueduct. He's bought enough water and land, and he brings the water in 1913 to Los Angeles. Listen to the descriptions. This is from the Los Angeles Times, 1913. And we're going to come back to water, by the way, because water myths are very important to a culture, and we're going to look at water as a symbol here. But the Times says the waters came in a wall reaching from side to side and about 2 feet high. It rolled over the top of the cascade and surged downward. Its front was almost a straight line, a rushing wall of water, with all below it dry and dusty. Soon the entire cascade was a roaring, rushing waterfall, growing larger every minute. Now Mulholland uttered the exhortation he would forever be famous for. And it's right down here, if you haven't seen it, at Riverside. There it is. He gestured toward the rushing water. Take it. Oh, right? There it is. And if you go to the monument down here, it's on Los Feliz Boulevard in Riverside. You've driven by it 1,000 times. There's a big water pipe there you can stand in, and there's a little plaque that says, there it is, take it. One man in a feathered Tyrolean hat leaned over the edge and wondered aloud how fast the water was flowing toward the new San Fernando Reservoir, some ways down in the valley. Mulholland and Eaton had also been buying up most of the San Fernando Valley, and that's another part of this story. So the reservoir is there. As the man bent over, the hat blew off his head and fell into the rushing water. Mulholland, who was passing by at that moment, leaned in and told the man with a typical engineer's precision, "You'll find the hat at the dam in 7 minutes." The completion of the aqueduct in 1913 was a personal triumph for Mulholland, and we wouldn't have the city we have today without it, despite the theft or because of the theft. And yet, when you undertake a project this large, this massive, there are always issues, there are always stories. So, for example, you've seen the film Chinatown. The dire predictions about lack of water didn't turn out to be true, but that didn't mean that Mulholland and Eaton and some of his friends, like Otis Chandler, didn't profit from it by buying up the San Fernando Valley, where they stored much of the water. During the 8 years it took to build the aqueduct, the city's population had more than doubled, and yet there was no strain on the water supply. The city had enough water. The San Fernando Valley did not. And so the water continued to come from the Owens River Valley, only now it's going into the San Fernando Valley, which is basically pasture land at this point. Again, the Owens River Valley people did not, now they see the full scope of what's happening, and they begin to increase their resistance. Early on the morning of May 21st, 1924, dynamite destroyed the aqueduct at a critical point. The city sent out private investigators and offered a $10,000 reward, but no one in the Owens River Valley would turn their neighbor in for the reward. And they considered it an act of self-defense. This continued on and on. Even after the aqueduct is completed, Mulholland received hundreds of threatening letters. His only comment, he was very taciturn most of the time, was that, quote, he half regretted the demise of so many of the valley's orchard trees because now there were no longer enough trees to hang all the troublemakers who live in the Owens Valley. This Owens Valley War ended effectively in November 16, 1924, when 70 armed men from the valley seized control of the aqueduct gate and completely shut off the flow to the river. Other people in the area joined them. The California governor refused to send in the militia. The local sheriff declared himself a friend and sympathizer of the rebels. Newspaper reporters from as far away as Paris came to report on it. And the Los Angeles Times, even the Los Angeles Times, editorialized that the farmers were honest, earnest, hardworking American citizens who looked upon Los Angeles as an octopus about to strangle them. In 1927, four masked men blew up a 45-foot section of the aqueduct. Mulholland sends out horseback riders with shoot-to-kill orders, and it's looking bad, but then the Owens Valley Bank collapses, and that is the effective end of the resistance. And Mulholland's triumph now is complete. He's undertaken this massive engineering project. He's gotten it done. He's fought off the people from whom he stole the water. He has arrived. What do you think happens next? He has arrived. He's very famous and lauded throughout the city. He has this wonderful line. This is Gary Christ. His name was even being batted about as the next mayor of Los Angeles. When he was asked to run, he responded, "I would rather give birth to a porcupine backward." On March 12th, 1928, the St. Francis Dam collapsed in Ventura, releasing a 15 billion gallon flood that was one of the greatest civil disasters in American history. The water had a 75-foot high wave and scoured a path to the sea. So it's up in there and it's heading out toward the sea from Ventura, or around Ventura, 2 miles wide and 70 miles long. Think of this, 75-foot high wave, 2 miles wide, 70 miles long, ending in the ocean. It left much of Ventura County under yards of muck. It killed 500 people. It was his dam. It was his, and he had cut corners on it. Or, it's debatable. But basically, it was that old Greek problem of hubris. Weeks later, bodies still were washing up, some in San Diego. A horrified journalist wrote of the flood's aftermath. Thousands of people in automobiles are slushing through the debris looking for the dead. Bodies have been washed into the isolated canyons. I saw one alive, stuck in the mud up to his neck. Alive. Christ writes this: most of the blame was being pinned on one man, William Mulholland, the person entirely responsible for the dam and its location. "Resign now," ran a headline in the LA Record. A handwritten sign on the side of a destroyed ranch house in the Santa Clara Valley was more blunt: "Hang Mulholland." Death threats against the chief became so common that an armed guard had to be placed at his family home in LA. At a meeting of the Board of Water Commissioners on March 18th, a visibly distraught Mulholland offered his resignation as chief engineer, after which, according to one witness, quote, "he slumped into the chair, buried his face in his folded arms, and sobbed like a broken-hearted child." A board of inquiry blamed Mulholland for filling the reservoir too quickly and ignoring the signs that it was leaking dangerously. There were plenty of signs that this was going to be a problem. He ignored them. Shortly thereafter, he was forced to resign in disgrace. He died in 1935, and a friend of his said it was the damned dam that killed him. Tricksters, tricking themselves, teaching us lessons along the way. D.W. Griffith. Wow, what a story. 1875, Kentucky, on a farm. His father, Jacob, was a doctor, a soldier, a prospector for gold, and a state legislator, because you could do all that stuff in the 19th century all at once. Lost their fortune during the Civil War. This is important. And the father, Jacob, did nothing after that. He just kind of sat down and stopped living. But he fed his son with stories of exotic, dangerous adventures, and leaving the education of David, Wark Griffith, to his daughter, Maddie. When he was a teenager, they moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and David became an avid reader. He loved Robert Browning, Leo Tolstoy, Charles Dickens, and he enjoyed Civil War histories. You already know why this is important, right? He began writing plays, took singing lessons, tried acting, was an usher, a stagehand, an extra. In fact, he was an extra in 1896 in two plays starring the great actress Sarah Bernhardt. Got into his blood, becomes an actor, moves to New York, and eventually makes his way to Biograph, one of the first American film studios, and was hired as an actor, but began saying, hey, why don't you do it this way? And thus becomes a director. In fact, his first film, The Adventures of Dolly, debuted in New York's Union Square in 1908. According to his wife, Linda, there was not a snore in the hall during the 9-minute film. Biograph took this as a great success. In comparison to other films of the era, Dolly was technically advanced. It was well crafted, had rounded characters and action scenes, actually. It sold 25 prints. Griffith would eventually direct over 60 films in the next 6 months, earning $50 a week. Stephen, I always think of you when I read this part. This is from Christ. Shortly before the start of filming, Griffith wisely consulted with the most experienced movie man he knew, Billy Bitzer. Anybody ever heard of Billy Bitzer? No, because you've heard of D.W. Griffith. He was the principal cameraman. And they worked together, but it was Bitzer who really understood how to make movies. He was the cameraman. And remember, there's just the cameraman and the director at the beginning. I love this description of Bitzer. A rather pudgy, cigar-chewing problem solver. He grabbed a nearby laundry cardboard and wrote down all the parts of a story that you have to have in a film. Heart, and he put down these categories: heart, interest, drama, danger, comedy, rescue. That's it. Heart, interest, drama, danger, comedy, rescue. It proved to be, and still does prove to be, a very good formula. He eventually meets Mary Pickford, brings her on to his projects, and starts innovating the fledgling industry with his technique. He took risks that were essential to a new medium like this. Instead of just, and you know, this is the key to creativity and innovation, is you don't just copy, you push the form, right? Like a trickster, you push the convention, right? He was the first to consciously use many techniques of contemporary film. Subtitles, night photography. What? Night photography. The still shot, camera pans, fade-outs, and close-ups. He also had an endless supply of ideas about how to shoot scenes, how to direct actors, and how to edit. 1919, he joins forces with Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and Douglas Fairbanks to found United Artists. All right. But that's not his trickery. This is his trickery, right? First of all, to understand Griffith, remember 1875 he was born in the South. You must understand the cult of the lost cause. Anybody ever heard of this before? Yeah. I'm a Southerner. I know the cult of the lost cause. It's not overstating to call it a cult. And if you ever wondered why all those Confederate statues appeared in the late 19th and early 20th century, it's a direct result of the cult of the lost cause. What is the lost cause? It's actually fairly simple. It's a myth. It's a myth in the way we talk about myths. It's a myth that's true for the people who believe it or who are held by it. That the South, while defeated, had the noble cause. It was the lost cause, but it was the more noble. It wasn't about slavery. It was about a way of life and protecting that. And a few years ago, I would have said, people really believe this, but I don't think I need to say that anymore. I think you see it all the time. People really believe this. The mayor of New Orleans a couple of years ago took down some of these statues, and he's an interesting guy named Mitch Landrieu. Wrote an article for the Smithsonian about why he did that. He's a Southerner, New Orleans, and he found this document, which is it's just a document he found that explains the lost cause. I don't want to get into it too much, but here it is. The cult of the lost cause had its roots in the Southern search for justification and the need to find a substitute for victory in the Civil War, a substitute for victory. In attempting to deal with defeat, Southerners created an image of the war as a great heroic epic. Getting close to Griffith now. A major theme was the clash of two civilizations, one inferior to the other. The North, invigorated by a constant struggle with nature, had become materialistic, grasping for wealth and power. The South had, quote, a more generous climate. Anybody here from the South? The climate is not generous. It's brutal, but okay. The more generous climate, which had led to a finer society based on veracity and honor in men, chastity and fidelity in women. Thank you very much. Southerners who fought in the Civil War and Southerners who continued to live in the South were tragic heroes. They were doomed to struggle with this preservation of a higher culture, a superior culture, a supremacist culture. There was an element of chivalry involved, about taking care of their womenfolk and fighting for a noble but lost cause. It's still around. I remember teaching in Alabama when I first started and ended up talking about the Civil War for some reason, and one of my students said, oh, well, it wasn't about slavery. And I'm like, well, I'm looking at the Declaration of War and the Constitution of the Confederacy, and it says slavery. No, it's not about that. It's about Northern aggression. I'm like, it's fascinating and problematic. So this is the stew in which D.W. Griffith was steeped. And then you add to that these great stories, these epics. It was almost inevitable in some sense that he produced Birth of a Nation in 1915. Premiered here in Los Angeles, February 1915. The title was called The Klansman. And that's because it was based on a novel, actually a trilogy, about the Civil War, right out of the Lost Cause mythology. There's a Baptist minister named Thomas Dixon. Racist, bigoted, melodramatic stage play. And Griffith picks it up and makes it into an epic film. The film is still used today as recruitment for Klan members. So the film is about the South and the Civil War. It's the lost cause on film. It has blacks represented by whites in blackface. It has black men looming and threatening white women. It's horrible. It's It's just horrible. It's just a terrible film that filmmakers agree is the single most important film in American history. It contained all the technical innovations, right? Refinements, artistic achievements, including a color sequence at the end, Birth of a Nation. 3 hours in length. Remember when Griffith started, he had a 9-minute film and he blew everybody away. This was 3 hours. I've never seen it. I can't get through it, but his original budget was $40,000. Gradually balloons, you know that story. The NAACP pickets the film for its racist and vicious portrayal of blacks. Lots of people oppose it, but the large majority of the American public love it. This reminds me of Bamboozled, Spike Lee's film. Do you know that? We can get into that later. Woodrow Wilson said, "It's like writing history with lightning." And you're like, oh, maybe he's talking about the technical aspects. No. Continuing the quote, "My only regret is that it is all terribly true." All right, well, we could go into this for hours, but lots of technical innovation, overwhelming spectacle, right, is what this is, which moviegoers never seen. They're blown away, right? And the content, they're like, oh yeah, whatever. Whatever. There are these reactions. There is this resistance. And Griffith is dumbfounded. He is genuinely dumbfounded by the reaction to Birth of a Nation. Because these are the stories he was weaned on. The South is more noble than the North. The blacks are happy in slavery. He believed that. And yet, he's one of the greatest filmmakers who's ever lived. So, I love this. In 1916, he comes up with Intolerance. He's so shaken to the core by the negative reaction, even though a lot of it was positive, most of it was positive. He's so shaken by the negative reaction to Birth of a Nation that he creates another epic film called Intolerance. Because, you know, he was the victim of intolerance. He knew it well. And I won't go into this, but it's basically an answer to his critics. And it goes, there's like 4 threads: the modern story, the Judean story, the French story, and Babylon. And what taught the through line through all these epics is, who is it? It's the famous actress Lillian Gish. Lillian Gish, a recurring cameo shot of Lillian Gish as the eternal mother. She endlessly and eternally rocks a cradle. And this kills me. Accompanied by the title from Walt Whitman's poem, Leaves of Grass, out of the cradle, endlessly rocking. Her iconic image, rocking the cradle of humanity, serves as a symbol of continuity for the entire history of the human race and a representation of the cycle of life and death. Griffith gradually became more and more obscure and was eventually forgotten and died unrecognized and alone. All right, I got to keep moving because it's Sister Amy. Oh my God, Sister Amy's here. Amy Elizabeth Kinney, 1890. Her first husband, she was born into a religious household, but she didn't like the religion of her household. She called it a tambourine-thumping Salvation Army religion, which was her mother's. So she begins to rebel by reading novels and attending movies. See how this all begins to merge. She gets involved in Scopes trial in 1925 in Tennessee, which was where John T. Scopes was charged under a new Tennessee law for teaching evolution in the schools. Clarence Darrow comes in for the defense. William Jennings Bryan comes in for the prosecution. Great film called Inherit the Wind is about this moment. But this is about Sister Amy. She marries Howard Stewart McPherson in 1912, gives birth to a son, and they try to settle in Providence, Rhode Island. But Amy is a wanderer, like a trickster. She's not happy with convention. She gets, in Providence, Rhode Island, she gets a call to preach the gospel. I don't know if you all know about this, but that's a thing, a call to preach the gospel. Where I grew up, in my Baptist heritage, that's all you needed. You didn't need an education. You just needed a call. And I've heard many an illiterate preacher who had the call but didn't have an education. She runs out on Mr. McPherson. In 1915, she leaves her husband, taking the children, in a Packard touring car. Painted on the side is, "Jesus is coming soon, get ready." She preaches all along the way, tent revivals and churches. She would whip up the crowds by speaking in tongues. Anybody ever seen that? It's fascinating. It's called glossolalia. Did I put glossolalia in? No. Oh, yeah. Sharon Lineker checks my slides for content. She's like, well, you've got 2 words in here I've never heard. Corporophilia and glossolalia. I'm like, you don't want to know. Yeah, glossolalia, speaking in tongues. I've been around it a lot. It's absolutely fascinating. It goes back to the book of Acts, in fact. All right, so she lands in Los Angeles. By the way, this is the time Manly Hall is in Los Angeles and starting to flourish as well. Secret Teachings comes out about this time. Secret Teachings of All Ages. Our founder, Manly Hall. Well, just down the street, she's creating the Angelus Temple in Echo Park. In 1926, and this is something about tricksters too, is they use the technology. And so Amy starts a radio program. And this is from Gary Christ, again, a quote. "For a charismatic evangelist like Sister McPherson, Los Angeles in the late 1910s offered particularly fertile ground. Despite the decades' influx of godless movie people and their trailing entourage of wannabes and hangers-on, the city had remained a magnet for aging health seekers, and their search for a sense of community and purpose had already turned the city, in one writer's words, into, quote, the most celebrated of all incubators of new creeds, codes of ethics, and philosophies, not to mention a breeding place and rendezvous of freak religions." That's our topic next week. "The lost souls for whom Theosophy at Loma, I'll talk about it next time, was too outre, and social utopianism too woolly-headed and political, were a natural audience for Sister Amy, Sister McPherson. She knew this better than anyone. Certainly, Los Angeles was ripe for revival," she wrote in one of her memoirs of this period. "This great metropolis appeared to afford perhaps the greatest opportunity for God of any city in America. Thousands of tourists were coming from every state in the Union, remember? Many coming to reside here. And their other needs had been provided for, but not their spiritual needs." But Amy was no ordinary preacher. Again, this is from Gary Christ's book. Perhaps the most, I love this, trickster stuff abounds here. Perhaps the most beloved and well-attended of the Angelus Temple offerings were Sister's Sunday night illustrated sermons. Genius, right? Never one to underestimate the value of spectacle and the stage imagery in winning souls for Jesus. She borrowed heavily in these productions from the techniques being perfected by Hollywood studios a few miles up the road. She often competed with local movie productions for rentals of costumes, lighting equipment, and animal extras. She created in partnerships with the temple's own set designer and stage manager. Her illustrated sermons were heavy on costumes and pageantry, often featuring tableaux of biblical scenes with a cast of a dozen. Once she showed up as a USC football player to dramatize a sermon about carrying the ball for Christ. On another Sunday, she donned a policeman's uniform and posed with a highway patrolman's motorcycle to, quote, put sin under arrest. Even the biggest Hollywood stars were impressed by her theatricality. You give your drama-starved people a theater which they can reconcile with their narrow beliefs, said one Charles Chaplin. Whether you like it or not, Chaplin said, you're an actress. Oh, here's another story I love. When hundreds of Klan members appeared at one of the sisters' evening services in 1924, she told them a parable about Jesus appearing to an aged black man who had just been refused admittance into an all-white church. Don't feel sad, my brother, Jesus told him. I, too, have been trying to get into that church for many years. Sisters stared at the Klansmen in silence until one by one they rose from their seats and exited the temple. After a time, they returned, minus the white robes, which park attendants allegedly found the next morning stuffed into the bushes around Echo Park Lake. Sister Amy, well, there's got to be something, right? So I'm just going to read from Chris, if you don't mind. He tells the story better than I can. On May 18th, 1926, Sister set out for a relaxing day at the beach, and as if tempting fate, she chose a resort close to Venice. I guess Venice had a reputation even. For the next few hours, Sister, clad in a pea green bathing suit, worked on notes for that Sunday's sermon, stopping occasionally for a dip in the brisk Pacific as fully dressed Emma Schaefer, her assistant, looked on. At some point, Sister began thinking about a lantern slide talk she was slated to give at the temple that evening. She had presented this show. Oh, I don't want to get into this. Okay, sorry. Right, so the secretary goes to get her an orange juice. Her assistant goes to get her an orange juice. And she says, I guess I'll have another swim while you're gone. When Schaefer, the assistant, returned to the beach tent sometime later carrying a glass of orange juice, she saw, or thought she saw, Sister McPherson swimming far out into the water. She watched the figure anxiously until she realized it wasn't Sister at all. Schaefer scanned the other bathers in the water but saw no one who resembled Sister Amy. Frantic, she ran up and down the shoreline, squinting into the surf, looking for that pea green bathing suit. After an hour of fruitless searching, she summoned the lifeguards. A small group of mourners gathered, wandered aimlessly, occasionally dropping to the sand to pray, unable to stop their tears. Amy is with Jesus. Pray for her, they chanted. A Coast Guard cutter patrolled just offshore. Deep-sea divers went into the water. She was gone. God wouldn't let her die, one of her believers told a reporter. She was too noble. Her work was too great. Her mission was not ended. She cannot be dead. Already one young church member had drowned herself in grief. I know. Soon after that, a diver died while trying to find McPherson's body. In the coming days, Chris continues, her followers would dynamite the waters of Santa Monica Bay, hoping to raise her body from the depths, yet the blast surfaced only dead fish, and the passing time merely gave rise to countless rumors. She'd disappeared to have an abortion. or plastic surgery or an affair. Notice what happens with stories. Stories are always constructed over an empty space. And so they start to, anyway. Soon witnesses begin to come forward and contradict the report that she had vanished into the water at all. There were sightings all over, of course, right? There have to be. I know her well by sight, said one detective from San Francisco, and I know that I'm not mistaken. I saw her here. A ransom note was delivered to her mother, Minnie, demanded $50,000 for the safe return of Sister Amy. Keep the police away, mum's the word, the note said. Some faithful church members clung to the belief that she would be resurrected. By the summer of 1926, writes Gary Christ, no woman in America commanded more headlines than the vanished Sister Amy. Okay. Prayers are answered. After a month of mourning and rumor, Amy Semple McPherson turns up in Agua Prieta, Mexico, just south of Douglas, Arizona. She claimed to have walked across, quote, the burning sands of the desert to flee kidnappers and then collapsed. She was taken to the hospital, and in a phone call with the staff, her mother confirmed her identity by telling them the location of a scar on her finger and of her daughter's ability to provide the name of her pet pigeon. Once she'd recovered from her state of collapse, McPherson gave a bedside interview, saying she'd been lured into a car after swimming and taken across the border by 3 Americans, including a man named Steve. Steve, it's always. And a woman named Rose. She'd been drugged and held in a Mexican shack for weeks, and her captors had planned on keeping her until they'd received a ransom of $500,000. But she foiled the plan, she said, when she sawed through the ropes that were restraining her and staggered 20 miles through the desert to Agua Prieta. She comes home to Union Station, 50,000 people are there. Airplanes drop roses from the sky. It was a magnificent spectacle, although the Chamber of Commerce called it a gaudy display. I'm going to cut the story short. She ends up indicted by a grand jury for fraud, basically. But what does she do? She creates a drama called The Story of My Life, right? It's a revival tour. This would not be one of her usual revival tours. It would be a traveling one-woman show called The Story of My Life, a theatrical extravaganza, climaxing in an account of her kidnapping and prayers for the defeat of the enemies of the old-time religion. Her message, the so-called case, had passed into the annals of yesterday, the legal case, but the glorious revival goes on. Amen, Amy. All right. To end up here, I'm sorry I'm a little long. I want to read to you from Lewis Hyde's book and ask you to think about these concepts of the trickster in relation to the stories you've just heard. Boundary crosser. Quote, trickster is a boundary crosser. Every group has its edge, its sense of in and out, and the trickster is always there at the edge, at the gates of the city and at the gates of life, making sure there is commerce. He attends the internal boundaries by which groups articulate their social life, all right, where there's someone's sense of honorable behavior has left him unable to act, the trickster will appear to suggest an amoral action, something kind of right, but mostly wrong, that will get life going again. Hunger. This is a really interesting thesis of Hyde's book, is that there's an evolutionary sense to the trickster, that it begins in nature as hunger and the need to trap food, right? So to trap food, you must become like the prey. And be careful not to trap or trick yourself. And so it begins in hunger and it ends in art, he says. Trickster starts out hungry, but before long he is a master of a kind of creative deception that, according to a long tradition, is a prerequisite of art. The mythology of trickster figures is, by one reading, the story of intelligence arising from appetite. Interesting. Shameless, right? We've got that one checked off. Hyde says, they're all the same, these tricksters. They have no shame and they have no silence. Hermes should bite his tongue when he's hauled before the assembly of gods, but he doesn't. Loki once had lips sewn shut by an irritated dwarf, but he ripped the thongs out and went right on talking. Joints. This is a really interesting concept that I don't want to spend too much time on. But just think about the interstices of things, the connections between things. That's what Hyde's talking about. He says the trickster lives at the connections between things. And we can get into that if you want. Basically, he calls them joint workers. Tricksters are joint workers. They're not much involved with making the firm and well-set joints that lead to classical harmony. What they like is the flexible or movable joint. If a joint comes apart, or if it moves from one place to another, or just loosens up where it began to stiffen, some trickster has been involved. In the net, I already said that. You've got to be careful as a trickster that you don't get caught in your own net. Think Wile E. Coyote, right? And then this is his conclusion, is that the trickster is no way at all. And I'll conclude with this. Thank you for your patience. This is Lewis Hyde, quote, better to operate with detachment, then better to have a way forward, but infuse it with a little humor. Best to have no way at all, but to have instead the wit constantly to make one's way anew from the materials at hand. Thank you for your attention.